What if one marriage could rewrite the fate of an empire? What if a young woman, born far from the throne she would later influence, became the silent architect of a nation's rise to power? Hidden beneath centuries of battles, alliances, and royal intrigue lies the story of a queen whose name few remember, but whose vision shaped the destiny of England itself. She was not a conqueror, not a warrior, and not the kind of ruler who left behind towering monuments. Yet without her, England might never have become the force that would one day rule the seas and reshape the world. In an age ruled by swords and ambition, she wielded neither. Her weapon was her mind, her shield, her quiet understanding of how power truly works. Not through the roar of armies, but through the strength of alliances, the subtlety of diplomacy, and the steadiness of reason. She arrived in England as a foreign bride, surrounded by doubt and whispers, her every move watched by a court that did not yet trust her. But in time, that same court would bend to her wisdom. She transformed from an outsider to a guiding hand, steering kings and kingdoms alike toward stability and greatness. Her story begins in 14th-century Portugal, a land of shifting loyalties and uncertain peace. Born into nobility, she was trained not just to marry well, but to think deeply. When England sought an ally against powerful continental rivals, her marriage was arranged as part of a grand diplomatic gamble. What seemed like a political transaction would become something far greater, a union that changed the balance of power in Europe. But her journey was not easy. Her voyage to England was filled with danger, her welcome met with suspicion. She faced a court divided by ambition and a people unsure of what to make of her. Yet through intellect, patience, and unshakable purpose, she turned doubt into respect and isolation into influence. Over time, she reshaped not only England's diplomacy, but its very sense of identity. This is the story of the forgotten heiress, a woman who redefined what it meant to lead from the shadows. Her legacy outlived her, though history nearly erased her name. The alliances she built endured for centuries. The systems she designed became the backbone of empire. And the wisdom she left behind still echoes in the way nations govern and negotiate today. She may have been forgotten by time, but her influence never truly vanished. It lives on in every moment of English history that values reason over conquest, peace over pride, and strength through understanding. This is her untold story, the story of the queen who changed everything without ever needing to take the crown for herself. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we uncover the extraordinary life and enduring legacy of the forgotten Portuguese princess whose quiet power reshaped the destiny of England and, in many ways, the world. What if a single marriage could rewrite the fate of an empire? That question haunted the royal courts of Portugal in the early modern period, when alliances were more than personal unions. They were strategies that shaped continents, redirected trade, and determined the survival of dynasties. The story of Portugal's forgotten heiress is a story of ambition, miscalculation, and the fragile balance between love and power. It unfolds at a time when Europe was a chessboard, and each royal marriage was a move that could protect or destroy a kingdom. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal had become a formidable maritime power. Its explorers reached Africa, India, and Brazil, opening sea routes that brought immense wealth and global influence. Yet behind the glittering surface of discovery and empire was a constant anxiety about succession. Monarchs ruled by divine right, but their bloodlines were fragile. A single death without an heir could plunge a nation into crisis. Portugal, like many kingdoms of its time, feared both foreign domination and internal division. To prevent either, marriages were arranged with great care, balancing love against politics, loyalty against ambition, and faith against power. The woman at the center of this story was a princess whose name history nearly erased. She was born into a line that traced its roots to kings and conquerors, but her life became a pawn in a larger game. Portugal's dynastic stability depended on her, yet she was rarely allowed to decide her own fate. Her childhood was filled with lessons not only in religion and courtly manners, but also in silence and obedience. Every gesture, every word, every potential suitor was weighed for its political value. From her earliest years, she was taught that her marriage would not be about love, but about the future of her nation. Portugal's royal family had a long tradition of marrying within the Iberian Peninsula. The neighboring crowns of Castile and Aragon, later united as Spain, were both rivals and partners. At times, peace between these kingdoms depended on shared blood, but the balance was delicate. If Portugal tied itself too closely to Spain, it risked losing its independence. If it looked elsewhere, such as France or England, it risked provoking Spanish hostility. The choice of spouse for a Portuguese heir or heiress was not just a family matter, but a question of national survival. In this setting, our forgotten heiress became both a solution and a problem. The death of a king without a clear male successor had always been the nightmare of monarchies. It invited pretenders, divided nobles, and invited foreign intervention. Portugal had faced such crises before, and each time, the kingdom barely escaped disaster. When the ruling line weakened again in the 16th century, the need for a secure succession became urgent. The heiress represented continuity, but only if her marriage strengthened the royal claim. The wrong match could destroy everything. So the court schemed, ambassadors negotiated, and the papacy watched closely, knowing that any alliance might shift the balance of Catholic power in Europe. At this time, Portugal's wealth had drawn the envy of its neighbors. Gold and spices from the east, sugar from Brazil, and the profits of the Atlantic slave trade made Lisbon a capital of global commerce. But wealth also attracted ambition. Spain had already united its crowns through strategic marriages, and now looked toward Portugal as a potential prize. The heiress's hand in marriage thus became the key to either preserving Portugal's sovereignty or delivering it to a foreign crown. Behind the scenes, envoys carried secret letters, courtiers spread rumors, and priests whispered of divine will. Everyone understood that one marriage contract could decide whether Portugal would remain free or become part of a larger empire. The young princess was aware of her importance, but not of her destiny. She grew up surrounded by advisors, tutors, and attendants who reminded her of her duty. Her father, a cautious monarch, understood that her value was both political and symbolic. He wanted her to marry a man who would defend Portugal's independence, but also support its colonial ambitions. The problem was that few princes could meet both conditions. Many European courts courted Portugal's favor, offering wealth or military aid in exchange for a marriage alliance. Yet each offer came with strings attached. A match with France might alienate Spain. A match with England might anger the Pope. A match with the Habsburgs might risk foreign control. Every possibility carried danger. While kings and ministers debated, time passed. The heiress came of age, her beauty and intelligence becoming the subject of fascination and envy across Europe. She had admirers, but none could approach her without permission. Her letters were read by advisors before they left the palace. Her portraits were sent to foreign courts as part of negotiations, each brushstroke a tool of diplomacy. Yet as years passed without a decision, the question of her marriage became a public matter. The people of Portugal, proud of their independence, feared that the court might sacrifice national freedom for temporary peace. Eventually, politics triumphed over personal choice. The heiress was promised to a member of the Spanish royal family, a union meant to secure peace between the two crowns. It was a decision driven by fear more than hope. The court reasoned that aligning with Spain might protect Portugal's trade routes and prevent invasion. But the reality was more complex. Spain, under the powerful Habsburg dynasty, sought not just alliance but absorption. The marriage, rather than a union of equals, became the first step toward domination. Many Portuguese nobles opposed it, seeing it as a betrayal of their sovereignty. Yet their protests were ignored. The marriage went forward, celebrated with great ceremony, but clouded by unease. The wedding united two crowns in name, but divided two peoples in spirit. At first, the union seemed peaceful. Trade continued, and both courts exchanged gifts and honors. But beneath the surface, resentment grew. The heiress, now queen, found herself isolated in a foreign court, her influence limited, her homeland slipping from her grasp. Letters from Lisbon spoke of unrest, of taxes rising to fund Spanish wars, of ships seized in foreign ports. Portugal's once proud merchants began to feel the weight of Spanish control. The queen's attempts to plead for leniency were ignored. Her marriage, once meant to preserve her nation, had bound it in chains. The final blow came when her husband's successors claimed Portugal outright, arguing that the union of blood gave them rightful rule. With no strong native heir to resist, Spain absorbed Portugal into its vast empire. What followed was 60 years of occupation, during which Portugal's independence was all but lost. The people, who had once celebrated their queen as a savior, now whispered her name with bitterness. She became a symbol of both tragedy and betrayal, remembered not for her virtues, but for the downfall her marriage had brought. Her children were raised under Spanish influence, and her letters, filled with regret, were locked away in archives, unread for centuries. Yet history is rarely simple. The heiress had been a victim of her circumstances, not a traitor to her country. She had been raised to serve the state, not to question it. Her marriage, though disastrous in outcome, was the result of a political calculation made by men who valued power over independence. Her personal sorrow reflected the larger tragedy of a nation caught between ambition and fear. Over time, Portugal would rise again, reclaiming its independence in the 17th century, but the memory of that lost queen lingered. She became a cautionary figure, a reminder of how fragile sovereignty can be when entrusted to diplomacy rather than conviction. Her story reveals the human cost of dynastic politics. The alliances that shaped Europe were not just contracts but human lives, often sacrificed to preserve the illusion of stability. For every celebrated union that strengthened a crown, there were others that ended in ruin. The forgotten heiress represents those silenced by history, women whose lives were used as instruments of policy. In her silence, we hear the echo of countless others who lived and died under the weight of royal expectation. She was not merely a pawn, but a person caught in a web of power she could not escape. If we look closely at her life, we can see how the fate of nations often turns on the choices of individuals who have no real choice at all. The Portuguese court, in seeking security through marriage, lost the very thing it sought to protect. Its empire, built on exploration and enterprise, fell under the control of a foreign dynasty. Its merchants were taxed for wars they did not start, its colonies governed by distant officials. Yet in the long arc of history, Portugal's spirit endured. The Restoration War that later reclaimed independence was, in part, a reaction to the memory of that earlier surrender. The people who rose up to free their nation did so in defiance of the decision that had bound them to Spain. In that sense, the heiress's tragedy became the seed of Portugal's renewal. Historians have debated her role for generations. Some see her as a victim of male ambition, others as a participant in her own undoing. But the truth lies somewhere in between. She was a woman of her time, bound by duty, faith, and circumstance. To judge her by modern standards would be unfair, yet to ignore her story would be to repeat the mistakes of the past. Her life reminds us that power built on calculation alone cannot last. The strength of a nation depends not only on its alliances, but on its belief in itself. What makes her story compelling is not just its political consequence, but its emotional depth. She lived in an age when queens were both revered and powerless, when their personal happiness mattered less than their fertility, and when their loyalty was tested by borders drawn in ink rather than blood. In private, she wrote of her longing for home, of her guilt over the suffering of her people, and of her hope that one day Portugal would be free again. Those letters, fragile with age, reveal a woman torn between duty and despair. They transform a historical event into a human tragedy. In the centuries that followed, her memory faded. New rulers, wars, and discoveries overshadowed her story. Yet each generation of historians who rediscovered her life found in it a reflection of their own time, a warning against blind ambition, a meditation on loyalty, and a question about how far one should go to preserve peace. Her story endures not because she succeeded, but because she failed in a way that changed everything. Her marriage did not just rewrite her fate. It rewrote the fate of an empire. The forgotten heiress's legacy survives in the lessons her life offers. She reminds us that nations, like people, can lose themselves in the pursuit of security. Her story shows that compromise without conviction leads to subjugation, and that the cost of peace can sometimes be greater than the cost of war. Above all, it teaches that history is made not only by kings and conquerors, but by those who, in silence, bear the weight of their choices. As Portugal's empire rose again in later centuries, expanding its trade and influence across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, the shadow of that lost generation remained. The dynastic gamble that once promised salvation had nearly destroyed the nation. It was a lesson learned through suffering, paid for with blood and time. When future kings sought to marry their heirs, they remembered the fate of the heiress who had once surrendered her freedom for peace. No treaty, however grand, could erase the memory of how one woman's marriage had altered the course of history. Today, her name is seldom spoken outside academic circles, but the consequences of her life still echo. The union of crowns, the fall of independence, and the long road to restoration all trace back to that single decision. It is a reminder that even in the grand sweep of history, the choices of one person can shape the destiny of millions. Her story, stripped of ceremony and myth, remains a powerful reflection of the human side of empire. It is a story of love denied, of power misused, and of a nation's struggle to reclaim its soul. What if a single marriage could rewrite the fate of an empire? For Portugal, it did. The forgotten heiress's wedding, meant to secure peace, brought conquest. Her life, meant to strengthen a dynasty, nearly erased it. Her silence, meant to preserve honor, became a lament that still speaks across centuries. And though history buried her beneath the victories of kings and the discoveries of sailors, her story remains one of the most revealing chapters in the long and complex tale of how empires rise and fall, not through the sword alone, but through the choices of those who bear the crown. In the century before Portugal rose to command the oceans, before the caravels crossed the horizon toward Africa and India, a young Portuguese princess stood at the center of a diplomatic gamble that would shape the future of her country. She was born into a royal family still finding its place among Europe's great dynasties, a family descended from the House of Burgundy that had secured Portugal's independence through courage and persistence. Her birth came at a time when the fate of kingdoms depended less on armies than on marriages, when the hand of a princess could redraw the map of Europe as surely as any battle. Her story, though long overshadowed by the explorers and conquerors who followed, reveals the early foundations of Portugal's survival. It was she who helped her small kingdom find its place among the powers of her age, through a union that linked Lisbon to London and ensured that the flag of Portugal would continue to fly free. The 14th century was an age of conflict and uncertainty. Europe's crowns were bound together by blood, faith, and rivalry. The kingdoms of Castile and Aragon fought to expand their influence across the Iberian Peninsula. France and England were locked in a struggle that would come to be known as the 100 Years' War. The papacy itself, divided between Rome and Avignon, offered little unity. Amid these shifting alliances, Portugal's independence was young and fragile. Its rulers had won freedom from Castile only after generations of war, but the victory had not brought peace. Castilian kings continued to claim that Portugal was rightfully theirs, while the Portuguese court sought every means to secure recognition from other European powers. The princess was born into this fragile peace, a symbol of hope for a kingdom still wary of invasion. Her father, the King of Portugal, ruled with wisdom but little security. He knew that a single defeat or an untimely death could undo all that had been built. His daughter's birth offered him a chance to strengthen the throne through marriage. From the moment she first opened her eyes in the royal palace at Lisbon, her future was not her own. Courtiers whispered of alliances, envoys discussed potential suitors, and foreign ambassadors sent reports back to their kings describing her lineage and the wealth of her father's court. Her upbringing reflected both privilege and burden. She was taught the languages of diplomacy, Latin, French, and the refined Castilian tongue used across Europe. She studied music, scripture, and the etiquette of courts from Paris to Naples. Yet her tutors reminded her daily that her life had a single purpose: to serve Portugal through the alliance her marriage would create. She grew up watching her brothers train for war and her father's counselors plan defenses along the border, while she learned how to bow, smile, and speak with the grace expected of a royal bride. Her youth passed under the weight of expectation, gilded but confined. At this time, Portugal's survival depended on diplomacy as much as on strength. The kingdom's small size and limited army forced its rulers to rely on foreign alliances. Castile remained the greatest threat. Time and again, Castilian kings tried to undermine Portugal's independence through intrigue, invasion, or political pressure. A marriage between the Portuguese royal house and Castile might have seemed a logical path to peace, yet it was a dangerous temptation. Too close a bond could allow Castile to claim Portugal's throne through inheritance. The Portuguese crown could not afford to risk its sovereignty in the name of peace. The royal council therefore looked north and west, beyond the Pyrenees, for allies who could counterbalance Castile's might. England presented itself as the most promising candidate. Though far across the sea, England shared with Portugal not only a common faith, but also a common enemy. The English kings, engaged in their long and costly war with France, sought allies on the continent who could offer them trade, ports, and support against both France and Castile, which often sided with the French crown. Portugal's ports along the Atlantic were valuable to English merchants and to English warships seeking safe passage toward the Mediterranean. For Portugal, an alliance with England promised security from Castile's aggression and recognition from one of Europe's most ancient monarchies. The political logic was undeniable. Still, the human cost would be borne by the princess herself. Her father's advisors began negotiations with English envoys. The proposal was bold, a marriage that would unite two distant kingdoms, binding the Atlantic through shared interest. Letters crossed the sea, filled with formal courtesies and cautious promises. The English envoys, upon visiting Lisbon, spoke admiringly of the princess's beauty and dignity. Chroniclers described her as fair-haired and sharp-minded, with a calm voice that carried both gentleness and authority. Her presence alone seemed to strengthen the legitimacy of her father. In England, however, the situation was grim. The country was still reeling from the devastation of the plague, which had taken countless lives. The war with France drained the treasury and divided the nobles. The young English king, eager to secure his borders and restore the glory of his crown, understood that a southern ally could change the course of the conflict. An alliance with Portugal would bring him access to valuable trade in wine, oil, and salt, while giving his ships a safe harbor far from enemy coasts. More than that, it would weaken Castile, which had aligned itself with France. The marriage between the English crown and the Portuguese princess thus became more than a romantic notion. It was a strategic necessity. The papal court approved the match after long consideration. The Church saw it as a way to stabilize relations between Christian nations during an era of constant strife. The Portuguese court celebrated the announcement with joy and ceremony, though the princess herself remained composed. She had known since childhood that her life would serve a higher purpose, and she accepted her role with quiet grace. Still, the thought of leaving her homeland filled her with sorrow. She would be the first Portuguese princess to cross the sea to a distant northern kingdom, leaving behind the sunlit terraces of Lisbon for the mist and chill of England. Her departure became a national event. On the morning of her voyage, the harbor filled with nobles, priests, and common citizens. Banners bearing the royal arms fluttered in the wind as bells rang from every church tower. The king himself accompanied her to the shore, his face solemn as he gave his blessing. He reminded her that she carried not only the honor of her family, but the future of Portugal. As she boarded the ship, the crowd fell silent. The sails caught the wind, and the fleet slowly disappeared into the horizon, bearing with it the hopes of a kingdom. The journey across the Atlantic waters was perilous. Storms threatened the fleet, and more than once the sailors feared the worst. Yet the princess remained calm, praying with her attendants and comforting those who trembled. Her composure became a source of strength for all aboard. When at last the English coast appeared through the mist, the sailors cheered and gave thanks. The English nobles waiting at the harbor received her with honor, recognizing the courage and faith that had brought her so far. Her arrival in England marked the beginning of a new chapter not only in her life, but in the relationship between two nations. The marriage ceremony took place in a great cathedral filled with candles and banners representing both crowns. The choir sang in Latin as the couple exchanged vows, sealing the union that would change the course of history. Chronicles describe her as radiant yet reserved, aware of the weight she carried. The English people, curious about their new queen from a distant southern land, were struck by her quiet dignity. Though she spoke with an accent foreign to their ears, her sincerity and grace won their affection. In the years that followed, she proved herself not merely as a consort, but as a stateswoman. She learned the ways of the English court, its customs and intrigues, and she navigated them with wisdom. Her influence extended beyond ceremony into the realm of policy. She encouraged trade between English merchants and Portuguese ports, granting privileges that strengthened economic ties. She supported the exchange of knowledge and culture, sponsoring translators and scholars who brought Portuguese navigation and agricultural techniques to England. Her correspondence with her family in Lisbon shows a woman deeply aware of her responsibilities. She wrote of her husband's challenges, of the difficulties of war, and of the fragile balance of power among Europe's rulers. Yet she also expressed hope that her marriage would ensure lasting peace. She took pride in Portugal's growing strength and in the friendship she had helped to build. Her letters reveal not regret but purpose, a belief that her life, though far from home, served something greater than herself. England, for its part, benefited greatly from the alliance. The partnership provided access to Portuguese ports and protection for English ships in southern waters. English wine merchants found new markets in Lisbon, while Portuguese sailors gained experience alongside English crews in the Channel. The two kingdoms began to see each other not as distant partners, but as allies bound by shared interests. This cooperation would later evolve into the enduring Anglo-Portuguese alliance, one of the oldest in European history, but its roots lay in the courage and patience of one woman. Despite her success, her life was not without hardship. She faced suspicion from some English nobles who distrusted foreign queens, fearing that she might influence the king to favor Portuguese interests. Her position required constant diplomacy, balancing loyalty to her homeland with devotion to her new country. She endured periods of isolation when war or politics kept her husband away, and she struggled with the cold and damp climate that never felt like home. Yet she never allowed sorrow to break her resolve. Her steadfastness became a symbol of stability in a time of unrest. When famine struck parts of England, she organized relief from her own treasury, earning the love of the common people. When soldiers returned from battle wounded and weary, she visited them personally, offering comfort and aid. Chroniclers began to refer to her as the Gentle Queen, the Southern lady whose kindness softened the harshness of war. Her compassion strengthened the bond between her two nations more effectively than any treaty. Her legacy deepened with time. Children born of her marriage carried the blood of both Portugal and England, linking their royal lines. Through them, future alliances would be negotiated and future wars avoided. Her descendants continued to honor the bond she had forged, citing her example as proof that peace could be achieved through faith and endurance. Even after her death, the friendship between the two kingdoms held firm. When later generations of Portuguese rulers faced renewed threats from Castile, it was England that sent aid, honoring the promise made in her name. The significance of her marriage extended far beyond her lifetime. By aligning Portugal with England rather than Castile, she helped preserve her country's independence. The alliance gave Portugal the confidence and protection it needed to expand overseas in later centuries. English merchants and sailors played a role in the early voyages of exploration, bringing knowledge and technology that would shape the age of discovery. Without the security provided by that early bond, Portugal might have been swallowed by its stronger neighbors long before it built its empire. For England, too, the marriage was a turning point. It provided a reliable ally at a moment when its continental ambitions were faltering. Portugal's ports and resources offered economic lifelines and military advantages. The friendship with Portugal allowed England to extend its influence into the Atlantic, paving the way for its own later ventures abroad. In this sense, the marriage between the Portuguese princess and the English crown was not a mere episode in dynastic history, but a cornerstone of Europe's later expansion. The princess herself remains an elusive figure in historical records, her name less known than those of the kings and conquerors she helped shape. Yet her influence endures in the long continuity of Anglo-Portuguese friendship, a bond that outlasted empires, revolutions, and wars. Her story reveals how quiet strength can achieve what force cannot. She bridged nations through patience, not conquest. She gave Portugal the stability it needed to grow and England the ally it needed to survive. In the quiet halls of Lisbon's old monasteries, one can still find traces of her life, letters, seals, and chronicles that speak of her voyage, her marriage, and her unshakable devotion to duty. Historians who read them sense the depth of her resolve, the intelligence with which she faced the burdens placed upon her, and the enduring consequences of her choice. She stands as a reminder that even in an age dominated by men and war, a single woman's courage could change the fate of nations. Her life, set against the restless backdrop of the 14th century, marks the beginning of Portugal's long story of diplomacy and endurance. While others won glory through conquest, she achieved it through peace. The alliance she embodied became the shield behind which Portugal flourished. The balance she helped create between England and Castile preserved the independence her ancestors had fought to win. In her patience lay the seed of empire, and in her sacrifice, the promise of survival. Though time has dimmed her name, her legacy remains clear. The forgotten Portuguese princess was not simply a royal daughter traded for alliance. She was the architect of a relationship that defined centuries. Her noble lineage gave her the right to command respect, but it was her intelligence and faith that ensured her country's future. In a world where crowns were fragile and thrones could crumble overnight, she built something that endured. The trust between two distant nations bound by the courage of one woman who understood that true strength lies not in domination, but in steadfast loyalty. The wind that carried the Portuguese fleet northward was fierce and cold, unlike the gentle breezes that drifted across the Tagus River. As the princess stood upon the deck, wrapped in a heavy cloak lined with fur, She gazed back at the receding shoreline of her homeland. The city of Lisbon was fading into a distant line of gold and gray beneath the morning sun. The air smelled of salt and tar, and the cries of sailors rose above the steady crash of the waves. Her journey to England had begun, a voyage that would test her courage, her faith, and her sense of destiny. Every mile that separated her from Portugal also drew her closer to a future she could neither escape nor control. The ocean stretched before her as both path and prison. The fleet consisted of several ships, each bearing nobles, attendants, and guards chosen for the journey. There were priests who prayed aloud as the sails filled with wind, scribes who kept records of the voyage, and servants who moved nervously about the deck, unfamiliar with the sea. The royal banner of Portugal fluttered from the mast, bright against the darkening sky. The sailors, hardened by years of coastal trade and war, whispered that the northern seas were treacherous and that storms rose without warning. Yet the princess did not waver. She walked the deck with calm dignity, her composure steadying those around her. In the eyes of many, she seemed almost unearthly, a figure blessed by divine protection. The first days of the voyage passed in uneasy peace. The sun shone bright, and the sea was calm. Dolphins followed the ships, leaping playfully in the wake, and the crew took this as a good omen. But as they sailed farther north, the weather turned. The sky darkened, and the wind grew violent. Waves rose high as hills, crashing against the sides of the ship with a roar that drowned out the sailors' shouts. The masts creaked, ropes snapped, and water poured across the deck. The princess's attendants wept in fear, clinging to one another as the ship pitched and rolled. Even the most experienced sailors crossed themselves and muttered prayers to the Virgin Mary. Amid the chaos, the princess remained calm. She refused to take shelter below deck, insisting that she would face whatever the sea delivered. Standing near the mast, she prayed softly, her voice steady even as thunder cracked above her. Those who saw her later swore that her calm presence gave them strength, that her courage kept them from despair. Through the long night, the fleet fought to stay together. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the sea gray and silent. One of the smaller ships had vanished, swallowed by the waves. The princess wept quietly when she learned of the loss, but she ordered prayers for the dead and comforted the survivors, telling them that faith would bring them safely to their destination. The journey continued with hardship. Food ran low, and several passengers fell ill from the damp and the cold. The sailors spoke of phantom lights upon the horizon and strange sounds in the fog. The princess comforted the frightened crew, reminding them that fear was the test of faith. She shared her own meals with the sick and ordered her personal physician to tend to the wounded sailors. Her compassion earned her loyalty from all who sailed with her. By the time the English coastline appeared at last, the crew regarded her not merely as a royal passenger, but as their guardian. When the lookout shouted that land was in sight, the ship erupted in cheers. The gray cliffs of the English coast rose from the mist like walls of stone. Villages dotted the shoreline, their chimneys releasing thin trails of smoke that curled into the cold air. The sailors gave thanks, kneeling upon the deck as the ships drew closer to harbor. The princess, exhausted but unbroken, watched the approaching land with mixed feelings. It was not the sunlit Portugal of her youth, but a foreign, colder world, ruled by customs she barely knew. She whispered a prayer in her native tongue, asking for strength to fulfill her purpose in this distant kingdom. The harbor was filled with people awaiting her arrival. English nobles, churchmen, and messengers of the king stood upon the pier, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the chill wind. Trumpets sounded as the Portuguese banners came into view. When the princess stepped ashore, a hush fell over the crowd. Her gown, though travel-worn, still shimmered faintly in the pale light. She bowed her head in greeting, her movements graceful and deliberate. The Archbishop of Canterbury offered a blessing, speaking of divine union and peace between nations. The nobles bowed deeply, impressed by her composure after such a perilous journey. The English people had heard many rumors about her before she arrived. Some said she was proud and cold, others that she was gentle and wise. Her arrival silenced the gossip. Those who saw her were struck by the calm authority in her bearing. Though her features reflected the warmth of the South, her manner was restrained, suited to the temper of the English court. The chroniclers recorded that her first words upon English soil were of gratitude to God and a blessing upon her new homeland. Her accent carried the music of Portuguese speech, and even those who did not understand her language felt moved by the sincerity in her tone. Her reception was grand, though marked by the austerity of the times. The kingdom was weary from war, and the royal treasury strained. Yet the king spared no effort to honor his new queen. The streets of the capital were decorated with garlands and banners bearing both the Red Cross of England and the Golden Shield of Portugal. Bells rang from every church tower, and crowds gathered to watch her procession. Despite the cold, she rode through the streets uncovered, so that the people might see her face. Her composure under the curious eyes of thousands won admiration even from her critics. She bowed to the crowd with quiet dignity, her gaze steady and her smile measured. At the royal palace, she was greeted by the court in full ceremony. Courtiers in velvet and fur knelt before her, offering gifts of gold, silver, and fine cloth. The king himself, tall and stern-faced, received her with courtesy. Their meeting was formal, witnessed by bishops and nobles. He praised her courage for enduring the voyage and spoke of the hope their union would bring to both kingdoms. She replied with equal grace, expressing her loyalty and her wish for lasting peace. Though they had exchanged letters through envoys, it was the first time they had met in person. Their words were polite, their eyes cautious, each measuring the other not as individuals, but as symbols of nations bound together by destiny. The wedding followed soon after, held in a great cathedral filled with light from hundreds of candles. The scent of incense drifted through the air as the choir sang hymns in Latin. The princess walked slowly down the aisle, her gown of white silk embroidered with gold, her veil long enough to sweep across the stone floor. The people watched in reverent silence. When she reached the altar, the king took her hand, and the vows were spoken. The archbishop declared the union blessed, and the bells of the city rang again. Outside, crowds cheered, celebrating not just a marriage, but a promise of peace between two realms. The days that followed were filled with feasts, tournaments, and music. Knights in shining armor jousted before the new queen, each eager to win her favor. Minstrels sang songs comparing her to the saints of old, her courage to that of Judith, her grace to that of Esther. Gifts poured in from nobles and merchants alike. Yet amid the celebrations, there was an undercurrent of tension. England's nobles were divided between those who welcomed the alliance and those who feared foreign influence. Some whispered that the Portuguese queen might sway the king toward policies that would favor Lisbon over London. Others suspected that her arrival signaled new taxes to fund wars in the south. The queen, aware of these murmurs, chose silence as her shield. She focused instead on her duties, listening more than she spoke, learning the names and temperaments of those who surrounded her. The court, once known for its quarrels and extravagance, began to change under her influence. Her presence introduced a quiet discipline. She encouraged prayer before council, charity before vanity. Servants noted that she dismissed none without hearing their pleas, and that she often visited the kitchens to ensure the poor were fed from the palace stores. The king, though cautious by nature, grew to respect her judgment. He consulted her on matters of trade and diplomacy, recognizing that her perspective extended beyond England's shores. Through her, envoys from Portugal were treated with honor, and agreements were reached that benefited both crowns. Her impact was not confined to politics. The ladies of the English court began to imitate her style of dress, favoring the modest elegance she preferred over the heavy ornament favored by northern nobles. Her calm demeanor and measured speech became a model of royal conduct. Even her piety influenced the realm. Churches dedicated to St. James and St. Vincent, patron saints of Portugal, began to appear across England, funded by merchants who profited from the new trade between the two nations. Her devotion inspired poetry, sermons, and art, all celebrating the idea of unity between distant lands under the grace of God. Despite her growing influence, the queen often felt the loneliness of exile. The English climate was harsh, and the gray skies seemed endless. Letters from Lisbon became her comfort. She read them in private, tracing the familiar handwriting of her family and longing for the scent of orange blossoms from her homeland. Yet she refused to let melancholy rule her. She found solace in faith, attending Mass daily and sponsoring works of charity in the city. Her chapel became a place of refuge for widows, orphans, and travelers. Her compassion softened even the hardest hearts at court. The people came to love her deeply. They called her the Southern Queen, the lady who brought warmth to their cold land. Her processions through the city became popular events. Children waved flowers as she passed, and merchants shouted blessings upon her name. She repaid their affection with generosity, often ordering that bread and coins be distributed to the poor during feast days. Her actions won her a reputation not of grandeur but of goodness, and that reputation proved far stronger than the fleeting favor of courtiers. As months turned into years, her presence transformed the court into a place of renewed stability. The alliance she embodied began to bear fruit. Portuguese ships docked safely in English ports, bringing wine and oil in exchange for English wool and tin. Trade flourished, enriching both kingdoms. English soldiers, once uncertain of their place in the wider conflicts of Europe, now had a trusted southern ally. Together, the two nations stood stronger against the threats that had once loomed from France and Castile. Yet the Queen's greatest influence lay not in trade or politics but in perception. She changed how England saw Portugal, from a distant and modest kingdom to a partner of equal dignity. Her grace in public ceremonies, her intelligence in council, and her unshakable faith impressed even the foreign ambassadors who came to the English court. They reported to their masters that this southern queen was not merely a consort, but a diplomat in her own right, one whose quiet authority commanded respect. Her marriage, though born of politics, grew into a partnership grounded in mutual respect. The king, initially formal and distant, came to value her wisdom. He often remarked that her calmness in crisis reminded him that strength did not always lie in force. When he faced rebellion among his nobles, it was she who counseled mercy over vengeance, saving countless lives. When he despaired at the cost of endless wars, she reminded him that peace, though fragile, was a treasure worth protecting. The chronicles of the time describe her as both gentle and resolute, a woman whose presence steadied a wavering crown. She did not seek power for herself, yet power seemed to gather around her naturally. Her words carried weight because they were measured. Her kindness was persuasive because it was sincere. Through patience and humility, she achieved what armies could not: unity in purpose and strength in alliance. Her arrival had reshaped not only the English court, but also the spirit of the nation. Her courage on the journey across the sea had become legend. Her steadfastness during storms turned into stories told by sailors for generations. The people saw in her the image of endurance, of grace tested by hardship. In the years that followed, poets compared her voyage to a pilgrimage and her marriage to a covenant of nations. Her name became intertwined with the promise of peace. The princess who had left Portugal as a symbol of alliance had become a queen whose influence would last for centuries. The wedding that joined two crowns had indeed shaken kingdoms, not through war or conquest, but through the quiet triumph of diplomacy and faith. Her arrival in England marked not just the beginning of a new reign, but the dawn of a partnership that would outlive them both. Though time would carry away the memory of her face and voice, her legacy endured in every bond forged between Lisbon and London, in every treaty that upheld their friendship, in every merchant ship that crossed the waters she once braved. Her journey had been perilous, her welcome uncertain, yet she turned those trials into triumphs. She had faced the wrath of the sea, the scrutiny of a foreign court, and the burden of expectation, and she had prevailed with grace. In the eyes of history, she remains the woman whose courage united two worlds, whose arrival changed the course of nations, and whose wedding, more than any battle, reshaped the destiny of a continent. Despite the warmth that the people showed her and the splendor of the celebrations that marked her marriage, the young queen soon discovered that not every heart at court was open to her. Behind the bright ceremonies and the ringing of church bells, a quieter, colder current ran through the corridors of power. The nobility of England, proud and suspicious by nature, whispered among themselves about the new foreign bride who had crossed the sea to share their throne. Some doubted her loyalty, others questioned her intentions, and a few went as far as to see her as a symbol of outside influence, a queen whose blood, faith, and manner were not their own. At first, these murmurs reached her only as faint echoes. Servants carried tales between chambers, scribes repeated court gossip under their breath, and visiting ambassadors hinted at the unease among the English peers. The queen, though new to the customs of her adopted land, understood at once what such whispers meant. A foreign queen could never afford to appear weak, but neither could she afford to seem proud. Every gesture, every word, every look would be weighed and judged not as the action of a woman, but as a sign of the kingdom that had sent her. The skepticism that surrounded her came from many places. Some of the older nobles still clung to old rivalries with southern Europe, remembering the shifting alliances and betrayals of past decades. Others feared that the new alliance with Portugal would drag England into distant wars or unwanted obligations. The merchants of London, though pleased with new trade, grumbled about taxes and tariffs that came with royal treaties. Even within the palace itself, ladies who had hoped to see an English bride on the throne regarded the Portuguese queen with quiet envy. They saw in her poise and beauty not an example to admire, but a threat to their own influence. In public, the queen met these suspicions with unshakable calm. In private, she often sat by the fire, reflecting upon the gulf that separated her from those around her. She knew she must earn respect not through charm or grandeur, but through consistency. She began by studying the customs of her new homeland. She learned the language more fluently, practiced the formal greetings used in court, and adopted the modest style of dress that English women admired. She spoke softly, listened carefully, and never corrected others when they mispronounced her Portuguese words. In every way, she sought to show that she had come not to impose her ways, but to belong. Still, there were moments when prejudice revealed itself plainly. At banquets, some lords would raise their cups but delay their toasts until others followed, as if uncertain whether to honor her presence. In council meetings, advisers sometimes ignored her opinions until the king himself repeated them, unaware they were her words. In the churches, priests sometimes mentioned her foreign birth when offering prayers, as though reminding their congregation that she was still not one of them. Yet each slight she met with quiet grace. She never responded in anger, never withdrew in wounded pride. Her patience, though misunderstood as passivity by some, was in truth the strongest weapon she possessed. The English court was a place where reputation could rise or fall overnight. A careless remark, a rumor whispered by a jealous rival, could undo years of dignity. The queen understood this better than anyone. She had been raised among courtiers and envoys, trained since childhood to read faces and measure tones. She recognized when words were wrapped in courtesy but edged with doubt. She could sense when a smile masked resentment. Such instincts guided her as she navigated the treacherous landscape of royal politics. The people's affection, though genuine, was also fickle. They adored her as the lady who brought prosperity, yet they could turn just as quickly if misfortune struck the realm. She knew that a single failed harvest, a costly war, or a scandal at court could turn admiration into resentment. For that reason, she worked tirelessly to secure the goodwill of both the common people and the church. She sponsored hospitals, funded repairs for monasteries, and ordered that bread be distributed in the streets during times of scarcity. These acts were not mere gestures of charity, but calculated steps toward stability. She understood that where nobles doubted her, the people could become her strongest shield. Her behavior soon became a subject of fascination. Some courtiers began to speak less of her origins and more of her composure. A few even confessed admiration for the way she turned suspicion into respect without ever raising her voice. Yet there remained a circle of detractors who refused to accept her. They whispered that she prayed in a foreign tongue, that she favored Portuguese envoys in matters of trade, that she secretly sent letters to her homeland urging her family to influence the king. None of these rumors were true, yet their persistence revealed how fragile her position remained. The king, aware of the quiet hostility surrounding his wife, sought to protect her without provoking further unrest. He commanded his nobles to treat her with honor and forbade any public slander of her name. But royal decrees could not silence private doubt. The queen realized that time and conduct would be her only true defenders. Slowly, she began to shape her own circle within the court. She surrounded herself with English ladies who were known for discretion and loyalty, offering them friendship and trust. In return, they became her eyes and ears, alerting her to the shifting moods of the palace. She also cultivated ties with the clergy, understanding that faith held great power over public opinion. Bishops who once viewed her as a foreign influence began to admire her piety. She attended Mass with humility, gave generous offerings to cathedrals, and personally visited convents where she supported the education of young women. Through such acts, she demonstrated that her devotion transcended nationality. Over time, sermons began to describe her not as a foreign queen, but as a model of Christian virtue. Yet even as she gained respect, the whispers did not vanish. Some of the younger nobles resented the growing favor she enjoyed. They saw her influence upon the king as dangerous. A few went as far as to claim that her calm manner concealed ambition, that she sought to guide the kingdom's policies from behind the throne. To these men, the very idea of a woman, especially one born beyond England's shores, advising their sovereign was intolerable. They met in private chambers, exchanging words of caution about her presence and questioning whether the alliance with Portugal had brought more burden than benefit. The queen was not blind to these undercurrents. Late at night, when the palace grew still, she would pace the long gallery overlooking the gardens, thinking of how easily distrust could undo all that she had built. She did not fear for her safety, but for the fragile balance she represented. Her marriage had been more than a union of two people. It had been a promise of peace between two nations. If she failed to win the confidence of England, that promise might crumble, leaving both realms vulnerable to the rival powers waiting to exploit their weakness. She chose, therefore, to answer suspicion not with argument but with endurance. Every morning, she appeared at court with calm assurance, her presence a quiet reminder that she would not be driven away by malice. She spoke little in public, preferring to let her actions speak for her. She visited the workshops of craftsmen, showing interest in their labor. She attended the hearings of petitioners, listening to grievances that others ignored. Her willingness to see beyond rank and wealth began to earn her genuine admiration. Even those who had doubted her started to recognize that her concern for justice was not feigned. Among the people, her reputation continued to rise. Merchants praised her fairness in trade matters, scholars admired her patronage of learning, and widows blessed her for the alms she provided. When her name was spoken in marketplaces, it was with affection rather than doubt. The nobles, seeing this growing affection, found it harder to sustain their skepticism. They began to realize that opposition to her might make them appear ungrateful or disloyal. Slowly, the sharpness of their gossip dulled. What had begun as mistrust turned into a cautious respect. Even so, the queen never forgot the early days when every smile hid judgment and every compliment carried the sting of condescension. She carried those memories within her like quiet scars, reminders of how fragile acceptance could be. Her strength lay not in defiance but in persistence. She learned that the surest way to silence rumor was to outlast it, to remain steady until gossip exhausted itself. As the years passed, her influence became undeniable. The same courtiers who had once doubted her now sought her counsel. Ambassadors who had questioned her purpose began to praise her wisdom in their reports. The transformation did not happen overnight, nor through dramatic gesture, but through countless small acts of integrity. She had turned skepticism into respect by showing that loyalty could cross borders, that dignity could speak more clearly than pride. The memory of those early whispers lingered, though, like a shadow that never quite vanished. She knew that being foreign would always set her apart in some eyes, that her accent and manner would always mark her as other. But she no longer sought to erase that difference. Instead, she came to see it as part of her strength. Her ability to bridge worlds, to understand both sides of every conflict, became the foundation of her influence. In the quiet moments before dawn, when she knelt in her chapel, she often reflected upon the strange journey that had brought her there. The storms at sea, the cold gazes of the court, the long struggle for acceptance, all had tested her in ways she could never have imagined. Yet each trial had also refined her, stripping away fear and doubt until only resolve remained. Her story, once told in whispers of suspicion, had become one of endurance. The people who had questioned her right to the throne now looked upon her as the steady heart of the kingdom. Her grace had outlasted rumor, her kindness had conquered prejudice, and her quiet strength had turned doubt into devotion. Though she would never forget how the whispers had begun, she took comfort in knowing how they ended, not with defiance or scandal, but with respect earned through steadfastness. The foreign bride, once doubted and judged, had become the queen who united hearts through patience, proving that faith and constancy could triumph over fear and pride. As the seasons turned and the first sharp edges of doubt dulled, the queen's place within the English court began to solidify. She had arrived as a stranger from the south, mistrusted and misread, yet her composure through hardship had begun to draw a quiet but growing respect. The courtiers who had once viewed her with suspicion now looked upon her as a steady force amid the uncertainty of politics. Her foreign birth, once seen as a disadvantage, began to seem like an advantage in a court hungry for new ideas and perspectives. She had endured the storm of prejudice. Now, she would begin to shape the very winds that once threatened to drive her away. It was not through grand speeches or declarations that she began to exercise her influence, but through the subtler instruments of conversation, presence, and persuasion. The queen had a way of listening that made even the most hardened noble feel heard. She possessed an unusual patience, a skill born from years of observing politics in her father's court. She rarely argued directly, preferring to ask questions that led others to consider her point of view without realizing they had been guided there. Her intelligence revealed itself not in bold statements, but in carefully chosen silences. Those who came to seek her favor often left believing their ideas had been confirmed, unaware that they had already adopted hers. Her earliest influence appeared in diplomacy. England, weary from wars and financial strain, stood at a crossroads. Its alliances were fragile, its enemies restless, and its future uncertain. The Queen recognized that lasting peace could not be secured by swords alone. She understood the delicate art of creating bonds between nations that extended beyond treaties and into trust. Her marriage had already established a foundation between England and Portugal, but she saw that alliance as only the beginning. She wrote letters in her own hand to the courts of Castile and Aragon, using language that blended courtesy with subtle persuasion. She reminded them that stability across the Iberian Peninsula was as vital to their prosperity as it was to England's. Her correspondence, often delivered through merchants and clerics rather than official envoys, carried a tone of warmth that softened even the most cautious responses. At first, the king regarded her diplomatic efforts with mild amusement. He saw them as harmless diversions for a queen who sought purpose beyond ceremony. Yet when her letters began to return with replies bearing seals of friendship, he took notice. Within a few years, trade between England and the southern kingdoms began to expand. English wool, once confined to northern markets, found new routes to Lisbon and Seville. Portuguese wine and olive oil flowed north in exchange, enriching both crowns. What had begun as a symbolic marriage alliance had grown into a network of economic and political partnerships. The Queen's insight extended beyond commerce. She understood that alliances must be built upon mutual respect, not mere advantage. When she learned that English merchants had treated their Portuguese counterparts unfairly in one port, she personally intervened. Without the king's prompting, she wrote to the Guild Masters of London, reminding them that a treaty between nations could be undone by the conduct of a few men. Her letter was read aloud in the Guild Hall, and though it caused murmurs of discomfort, it also inspired compliance. The merchants, recognizing the Queen's influence, began to refer to her as their guardian of peace. Her reach grew further when ambassadors from France arrived to renew discussions over old territorial disputes. They expected the Queen to remain silent, as most consorts did during matters of state. Instead, she received them privately in the gardens of the palace, under the pretense of a social meeting. There, surrounded by blooming roses and the soft hum of bees, she spoke to them with gentle precision. She reminded them of the suffering that endless conflict brought to both peoples, and of the power that peace held to enrich nations more deeply than war ever could. The ambassadors returned to their king with reports of her wisdom, describing her as a woman of rare judgment whose words carried the grace of a diplomat rather than the vanity of a queen. Such praise began to spread across Europe. In the courts of Burgundy and Flanders, envoys spoke of the English queen who blended kindness with intelligence, who understood commerce as deeply as faith, and whose counsel was sought not for charm but for reason. This quiet reputation elevated England's standing abroad. Other monarchs began to view the English crown not merely as a martial power, but as a realm guided by prudence and foresight. Behind this transformation stood the Queen, her name seldom mentioned in official records, but her influence felt in every gesture of diplomacy. Within England itself, her growing influence had a different effect. The nobles, once suspicious, began to compete for her attention. They discovered that her favor could bring them advancement or save them from disgrace. Yet she did not wield her power carelessly. When courtiers sought her endorsement, she asked not what they could offer her, but what they could offer the kingdom. Many left her presence unsettled, realizing that flattery held little value with her. Over time, the court began to change its tone. Vanity gave way to purpose, gossip to ambition. Even the king's advisors found that meetings in which the Queen participated were more focused, less prone to rivalry. Her influence upon the king himself deepened with the passing years. He had once regarded her as a quiet and dutiful consort, a figure meant to uphold ceremony and produce heirs. Yet he came to see her as his most reliable counselor. When his ministers quarreled, he turned to her for balance. When he hesitated over difficult decisions, she offered perspective shaped by both reason and compassion. He learned to trust her instincts, which rarely failed him. The chroniclers of the time would later note that during her presence at court, England experienced fewer internal rebellions and greater stability than in the decades before. The queen's intelligence was not the sharp, restless kind that sought to dominate. It was patient and deliberate, built upon observation and empathy. She understood people as much as she understood politics. She knew how pride governed men and how fear often hid behind arrogance. Her manner disarmed anger and encouraged honesty. Even the most defiant noble found it difficult to argue with her because she never argued back. Instead, she listened until the force of their own words exhausted them, then spoke a single, calm truth that left no room for dispute. The people, too, began to feel her influence in their daily lives. They saw her not as a distant figure of luxury, but as a queen who cared for justice. When a famine struck the northern counties, she ordered that grain from royal stores be sent at her own expense. She ensured that no family in those regions went hungry during winter. Her actions spread quickly through word of mouth, turning admiration into devotion. Ballads were written about her kindness, and mothers told their children stories of the queen who fed the hungry as if they were her own kin. Her charitable acts were not limited to relief in times of crisis. She reformed the management of royal estates, insisting that peasants working on crown lands be treated fairly. She appointed inspectors to prevent abuses by local officials and required regular reports on the living conditions of the poor. These measures, modest in appearance, changed the tone of governance. For the first time in memory, the crown seemed to care not only for its wealth, but for its people. Yet her greatest transformation lay in redefining what it meant to be a queen. Before her, royal consorts were expected to be ornaments of ceremony, figures of grace who stood beside their husbands but did not shape policy or opinion. The Portuguese queen changed that quietly, without confrontation or boast. She demonstrated that a woman could exercise influence without abandoning humility, that power need not come from authority but from understanding. Her presence at council meetings became common, her voice sought not as intrusion but as insight. The boundaries that once confined queens to silence began to fade. She encouraged learning among the women of the court, inviting scholars and theologians to give lectures within the palace. She believed that knowledge strengthened virtue and that education should not belong solely to men. Her patronage of writers and translators led to the spread of Portuguese poetry and philosophy in England. Some of the finest works of that century were dedicated to her, written in gratitude for her support. Through her influence, the women of the court found a new confidence, speaking more freely in matters of intellect and faith. Her redefinition of queenship extended even to matters of ceremony. She altered the tone of royal processions, replacing extravagant displays with gestures of humility. Instead of riding surrounded by jewels and silks, she often appeared in simple gowns, choosing to distribute alms along her route rather than showcase her wealth. The people found this humility endearing. It reminded them that their queen understood both splendor and struggle. Her restraint became a symbol of dignity, setting a standard that even foreign visitors remarked upon. In time, the clergy came to revere her as a moral compass of the realm. She did not challenge the authority of the church, but she encouraged it to focus on compassion rather than punishment. When accused heretics were brought before the bishops, she urged mercy where others demanded severity. Her belief that faith should heal rather than condemn found its way into sermons and writings across the land. Though she never sought to reform doctrine, her influence softened the harshness of religious enforcement in her time. Her ability to navigate between power and principle became legendary. She could disagree with the king without defiance, correct a noble without insult, and rebuke injustice without anger. Her mastery of diplomacy extended beyond borders and into hearts. She understood that lasting authority rested not upon fear, but upon trust. Even those who opposed her could not deny her wisdom. As her reputation grew abroad, foreign courts began to model their own queens upon her example. Letters from France and Burgundy spoke of admiration for the English queen who combined intellect with grace. Young princesses were taught her virtues as lessons in conduct. She became a symbol of a new kind of royal woman, one who ruled not beside the throne, but through the conscience of those who sat upon it. Her growing influence also reshaped the balance of power within the English monarchy itself. The king's advisors, once accustomed to acting without restraint, now found themselves accountable not only to him but to her silent scrutiny. She did not intervene openly, yet her approval or disapproval could determine a man's fortune. Ministers who sought favor began to measure their decisions by her standards. Gradually, honesty and prudence replaced arrogance and haste. The realm, long divided by ambition, began to find unity through the quiet authority of its queen. Even in foreign policy, her hand could be traced. When the king considered renewing war with a neighboring power, it was she who persuaded him otherwise. She reminded him that conquest won through force seldom endured, but peace built upon respect could last generations. Her reasoning prevailed, saving countless lives and preserving England's strength for prosperity rather than battle. The chronicles would later record that during her time, England experienced one of its longest intervals of peace in that era, a peace credited to her wisdom more than any treaty or army. Despite her success, she remained humble. When praised, she deflected credit to others. When honored, she insisted that glory belonged to God. Her modesty did not stem from false virtue, but from genuine belief that leadership was service. Those closest to her often marveled that she carried the burdens of diplomacy, charity, and reform without ever showing weariness. In private, however, she bore the cost of such endurance. Her letters from those years reveal a woman aware of loneliness, the quiet isolation that came with being both inside and outside every circle of power. Yet even that solitude did not diminish her resolve. She had learned long ago that influence was not about affection, but about responsibility. Her purpose had grown beyond the role of bride or consort. She had become the bridge between nations, the conscience of a court, and the embodiment of a kingdom's dignity. By the later years of her reign, the transformation she had begun was complete. England, once divided and uncertain, had become a realm of stability. Its alliances reached across seas, its merchants prospered, and its court stood as a model of order. The people saw in their queen not a foreigner, but a matriarch whose wisdom guided both king and kingdom. The nobles, once wary of her southern birth, now sought to emulate her restraint. The very definition of queenship had changed, not through proclamation, but through the steady influence of her character. When historians of later centuries wrote of that age, they spoke of the queen as the silent architect of peace. They described her as a woman who redefined power by wielding it with grace, who proved that intellect could be as strong as lineage, and who taught that the crown's greatest strength lay not in conquest but in compassion. Her life became a lesson that even within the strict confines of tradition, change could be achieved by patience, wisdom, and faith. She had arrived in England as a stranger and left it transformed. Its politics softened, its diplomacy strengthened, its very soul uplifted by her quiet will. The world beyond the crown had once been a place of suspicion and struggle. Through her, it became a realm of possibility. And so, the queen who had once been doubted as a foreign bride became, in truth, the heart of England itself, her legacy not written in battles or decrees, but in the enduring harmony she left behind. The queen's influence had matured into something no one in the kingdom could deny. Her quiet counsel had become indispensable, her insight trusted in both peace and the anticipation of war. The king, once cautious about sharing the burdens of rule, had learned to see her not merely as a companion, but as a strategist whose judgment could steer the course of nations. What began as advice offered in private chambers now shaped decisions that reached across the English realm and into the courts of Europe. Her position at the center of power was never declared in words, yet every minister understood that no major decision was made without her voice being heard. She had mastered the delicate balance between visibility and discretion. When the council gathered, she was not always present, but her influence hung in the air like a steady current guiding the tide. Even those who had once dismissed her as a foreign consort now found themselves repeating her arguments as if they were their own. England during those years stood on uncertain ground. Its wealth was growing, but its borders were restless. The rivalries of France, Castile, and the northern kingdoms threatened to pull the island once more into conflict. Trade routes were expanding, yet piracy haunted the coasts, and the loyalty of some nobles wavered between self-interest and duty. The queen, aware of these tensions, began to weave together a plan that would not only protect the crown, but elevate England's influence beyond the reach of its enemies. Her approach to politics was methodical, never impulsive. She began by strengthening the foundations at home. Through her network of trusted advisors, she collected information from ports, monasteries, and foreign merchants. These quiet channels became her own form of intelligence, a web of knowledge that reached far beyond the throne room. While others debated in the open council, she already knew the mood of the people, the state of the armies, and the intentions of rival courts. It was through this understanding that she could predict how events would unfold and prepare England to respond before danger even appeared. Her counsel first proved decisive when tension arose between England and France over disputed trade privileges. The French crown sought to impose restrictions on English merchants, threatening to cripple the flow of wool and tin that fueled the kingdom's prosperity. Many at court demanded a show of strength. A fleet sent across the Channel, an ultimatum delivered with the weight of arms. The Queen, however, urged patience. She understood that war would exhaust the treasury and undo the stability she had helped build. Instead, she advised a campaign of economic and diplomatic pressure. Under her direction, English agents began to negotiate with the Flemish and Burgundian cities that depended on English goods. She convinced them that France's restrictions would harm their own markets and persuaded them to side with England. Within a year, French merchants found themselves isolated. Their ports grew quiet and their coffers thin. France, expecting England to respond with force, found itself undone by strategy instead. The trade privileges were restored, and England emerged stronger. Its queen having proven that diplomacy, when guided by foresight, could win victories that swords could not. Her influence was not limited to trade. She understood the importance of naval strength in an age when power was measured by the control of seas. The English navy, though brave, had suffered from neglect and corruption. Ships were built without standard, captains paid without accountability. The Queen took it upon herself to reform this vital force. She began by ordering that the records of shipyards be examined, identifying those who inflated costs or delivered poor vessels. She recommended that trusted craftsmen from Portugal be brought to England to share their methods of ship design, known for combining speed with endurance. Her interest in maritime affairs was unusual for a queen, yet her southern upbringing had given her a lifelong understanding of the sea's power. She knew that a realm that ruled the waves could not easily be conquered. The ships built under her reforms were lighter and faster, able to outmaneuver larger fleets. When pirates began threatening English merchants in the Channel, it was these new vessels that drove them back. The success transformed England's reputation. No longer seen as a minor naval power, it began to command respect across the coasts of Europe. Foreign ambassadors took note, and chroniclers later recorded that it was the Queen's foresight that laid the groundwork for England's maritime strength in the generations that followed. Her hand was also visible in matters of alliance. The peace she had nurtured between England and Portugal became a cornerstone of European balance. Through her correspondence with her family abroad, she encouraged deeper cooperation between the two kingdoms, suggesting joint ventures in trade and exploration. It was her idea to send English navigators to Portuguese ports to study new instruments for sea travel, and in return, Portuguese sailors came to English harbors to learn northern techniques of navigation. This exchange of knowledge forged bonds that went beyond politics, uniting two nations in shared ambition. Her influence reached its height during the crisis that erupted when France sought to rally neighboring powers into a coalition against England. The French court, jealous of England's growing alliances and wealth, attempted to persuade Castile to join them. The Queen, foreseeing the danger, moved swiftly. She sent secret envoys to the Castilian court bearing gifts and letters written in her own hand. Her words, written with both warmth and precision, reminded the Castilian king of the shared ancestry and mutual interests between their realms. She appealed to his pride as a sovereign who should not serve as another's pawn. When the French ambassadors arrived in Castile, they found a court already inclined toward England. The coalition collapsed before it began, and the French crown was left isolated. The King of England, grateful for the Queen's foresight, declared publicly that she had saved the realm without raising a sword. The court applauded, but she accepted the praise with modest silence, knowing that influence was strongest when it appeared invisible. Her direct involvement in military matters was equally striking. Though she never stood upon a battlefield, her strategies shaped those who did. During a campaign to defend English holdings abroad, the army suffered from disorganization and conflicting commands. The Queen intervened quietly, suggesting that the king appoint a single commander loyal, not to his own ambition, but to the crown's cause. She recommended a young knight of modest birth, but proven discipline, a man overlooked by nobles because of his lack of lineage. The king, trusting her judgment, approved the appointment. Under that commander's leadership, the army not only regained lost ground, but secured a decisive victory that stabilized England's continental interests. The nobles, astonished that a foreign-born queen could perceive military potential where they saw none, began to look upon her with something approaching awe. Her understanding of warfare extended beyond strategy to the morale of those who fought. She organized supplies for troops, ensuring that no soldier went unpaid or unfed. She ordered the wives and children of men at war to receive stipends from the royal treasury, reasoning that a soldier who knew his family was cared for would fight with greater loyalty. These measures, though practical, carried deep emotional weight. The army began to speak of her as their unseen protector. Songs about her generosity spread through the camps, and banners were raised in her honor after victories. In the political heart of England, her authority grew with each success. The great lords, once accustomed to competing for influence, found themselves drawn into her circle. She did not seek to dominate them. Instead, she guided them toward unity. When disputes arose among the nobility, she often invited the rivals to dine at her table, arranging the seating so that conversation replaced resentment. Her ability to calm tempers with words rather than punishment became legendary. Many historians later wrote that her diplomacy within the court was as vital as her diplomacy abroad, for it preserved peace within the kingdom's walls even as England's reach expanded beyond them. One of her most remarkable achievements came during negotiations with the northern kingdoms. For decades, tension had simmered over fishing rights and trade along the cold seas that separated them. Skirmishes between ships often led to broader threats of war. The Queen, recognizing that these conflicts drained resources and distracted from greater ambitions, proposed a treaty based on mutual access and shared profit. She personally reviewed the terms, ensuring fairness for both sides. When the treaty was signed, it ended years of hostility and opened new markets for English goods. Merchants prospered, and the northern kings, impressed by her fairness, began to consult her envoys in later disputes unrelated to England. Her name had become synonymous with reason. Her counsel also extended to matters of royal succession and governance. She urged the king to establish clearer lines of inheritance to prevent future civil strife, drawing lessons from the turmoil she had witnessed in her youth. Under her guidance, the court established new codes that balanced the rights of the crown with those of the nobility, ensuring stability long after her lifetime. These reforms, though seemingly administrative, formed the backbone of a more orderly government, one less vulnerable to rebellion or intrigue. Beyond her political and military influence, her strategic thinking reshaped England's place in the world. She recognized that true power lay not only in conquest, but in perception. To that end, she encouraged the spread of English culture abroad. She supported the translation of English chronicles into Latin and other tongues, ensuring that stories of English valor and justice reached foreign courts. Artists and scholars found patronage through her, and their works carried subtle messages of the kingdom's strength and refinement. In time, England was seen not only as a power of arms, but as a beacon of intellect and civilization. Her correspondence with other queens and noble women across Europe created a network of influence that often surpassed that of kings. Through these relationships, she shared ideas on education, governance, and charity. This informal diplomacy, conducted through letters sealed with care and delivered across long distances, built a foundation of goodwill that formal treaties could not match. She understood that alliances rooted in friendship endured where those based on necessity crumbled. Perhaps the most telling example of her strategic foresight came during a severe financial crisis. Years of conflict had strained the treasury, and the crown faced mounting debts. Ministers proposed raising taxes, a move that threatened to ignite unrest. The Queen instead suggested a plan that combined austerity with innovation. She proposed cutting unnecessary court expenses and introducing new levies on luxury imports rather than essential goods. At the same time, she promoted domestic industries to reduce dependence on foreign markets. Her reforms balanced the books without burdening the poor, preserving both stability and loyalty. As her influence deepened, some at court whispered that the Queen ruled as much as the king himself. Yet no one could deny that her wisdom had brought prosperity. The king himself often declared that his reign would be remembered for peace and progress, all made possible by his wife's counsel. She never sought recognition, but those who watched closely saw how every major success carried her mark. By the later years of her life, the transformation she had envisioned for England had taken root. The kingdom stood stronger than it had in generations, its fleets feared and respected, its alliances stable, its merchants thriving. Across Europe, England's name was spoken with admiration rather than apprehension. Behind this reputation stood the Queen, the architect of influence who had reshaped her adopted realm not through conquest, but through conviction. She had proven that the mind could be mightier than the sword, that foresight could achieve what armies could not, and that a woman's wisdom could shape the fate of nations. Her legacy was not carved in monuments or recorded in decrees, but lived in the enduring strength of a kingdom she had helped guide to greatness. The Europe that once viewed her as an outsider now regarded her as one of its most skilled stateswomen. In her final years, when she looked upon the realm she had helped build, she saw a land at peace, secure in its place among nations. The alliances she had forged continued to hold, and the reforms she had inspired ensured order within. Though time would move on and new rulers would come, the principles she had instilled, prudence, fairness, and quiet strength, would endure as England's lasting inheritance from the Queen who had turned influence into art. The years that followed her passing revealed the true scope of what she had built. Her influence did not fade with her voice, but lingered in the institutions she had shaped, the alliances she had strengthened, and the balance she had restored to a realm once marked by discord. The Queen's legacy became the quiet architecture upon which England's later greatness stood. Her counsel had not only guided a single generation, but had set in motion patterns of thought and policy that would define the kingdom's place in the world for centuries to come. The stability she had nurtured at home became the cornerstone of England's growing confidence abroad. Before her arrival, the realm had often looked inward, preoccupied with its own feuds and rebellions. She had redirected that energy outward, showing that influence across borders could be achieved through diplomacy rather than conquest. The trade networks she expanded linked English ports to Lisbon, Seville, and the northern seas, turning England into a hub of commerce that rivaled older continental powers. These economic ties laid the groundwork for prosperity that endured long after her lifetime. The merchants who once carried her letters of goodwill became the agents of a new English presence in Europe, spreading both wealth and reputation. The reforms she had introduced to the navy and to maritime law gave the kingdom the means to protect its growing interests. Her insistence on accountability in shipbuilding and her encouragement of innovation created a fleet that could not only defend the coast, but project power across waters that had once been barriers. Generations later, when England began to reach beyond its shores toward exploration and trade, it was using principles she had first championed: discipline, efficiency, and foresight at sea. What had begun as a response to piracy and commerce disputes evolved into a tradition of naval mastery that became one of the defining features of England's global identity. Her diplomatic vision also continued to shape foreign policy. She had taught the Crown to value alliances built on shared interest rather than temporary convenience. The connection she strengthened with Portugal endured as one of the longest-standing alliances in European history, its benefits reappearing time and again when other friendships failed. Through her example, English diplomacy learned to blend firmness with courtesy, to win influence through consistency rather than coercion. These principles guided statesmen long after her death, influencing how England negotiated treaties, resolved disputes, and extended its reach across Europe and eventually the wider world. Perhaps her greatest legacy lay in the transformation of royal authority itself. The Queen had shown that strength did not depend solely on the sword or the decree, but on moral leadership and trust. She had elevated the idea of governance from mere command to stewardship. Kings who came after her inherited a model of rule that valued counsel, reflection, and the balancing of interests. Her example softened the image of monarchy without diminishing its authority. In the centuries that followed, when England's rulers faced internal strife or the demands of reform, chroniclers and courtiers often invoked her memory as proof that wisdom could preserve power where force would have failed. The effects of her influence reached even further, into the shaping of England's identity as a nation of reason and order. Her patronage of learning and her encouragement of education among women planted seeds that grew quietly through generations. The scholars she supported continued their work, preserving and expanding the intellectual vigor that came to define English thought in later ages. Her belief that understanding and justice were inseparable became a moral thread woven into the kingdom's political fabric. Laws grew fairer, administration more accountable, and public service more esteemed. These were not abrupt revolutions, but gradual evolutions, precisely the kind she had always favored. In the broader arena of European politics, her legacy was felt in subtler ways. The balance she helped establish between England and its continental neighbors created a precedent for measured diplomacy. By preventing reckless wars and fostering economic interdependence, she contributed to a longer period of stability that allowed nations to prosper rather than bleed themselves through endless rivalry. Historians later observed that the century following her reign saw fewer large-scale conflicts involving England than any in its recent past. This peace was not an accident. It was the outcome of habits she had instilled, habits of caution, foresight, and respect for negotiation. Even in religion, though she had not sought reform, her influence endured. The clergy she guided toward compassion over severity continued to preach a gentler vision of faith, one that emphasized mercy and understanding. This moderation left its mark on the English Church, tempering the extremes that often tore other nations apart. When generations later, England faced questions of conscience and belief, there remained a lingering memory of the Queen who had united piety with tolerance. Her personal example also redefined the expectations placed upon women of influence. She had shown that intellect and diplomacy were not confined to the council chamber, and that a queen could guide a kingdom without claiming dominion. The royal consorts who followed her took her life as a measure of possibility. Across Europe, her name became a reference point for wisdom and restraint. Chroniclers from distant lands wrote of her as the model of enlightened queenship, and even long after her death, foreign envoys visiting England would still mention her with respect. The echoes of her vision appeared in every generation that followed. When English ships sailed to distant oceans, when ambassadors negotiated alliances in foreign courts, and when reformers sought to reconcile power with fairness, they were carrying forward the principles she had lived by. She had not merely preserved her kingdom, she had prepared it for the future. Her influence had turned England from a power of the moment into a power of endurance. The geopolitical trajectory she set in motion became evident as centuries unfolded. England's transformation from an island realm to a central actor in continental and later global affairs could be traced to the stability she secured and the foresight she inspired. Her policies had shifted the kingdom's posture from reaction to initiative. Instead of being drawn into the ambitions of others, England learned to shape events for itself. Its diplomacy, its trade, and even its wars began to reflect a strategic patience that was distinctly her legacy. While later monarchs would pursue glory through conquest, her legacy reminded the realm that influence could be more lasting than victory. The alliances she formed endured, the systems she reformed strengthened, and the ideals she embodied remained embedded in the conscience of the nation. She had taught her adopted country that true power came not from domination, but from stability, credibility, and trust. In every corner of Europe, from the Iberian courts that had once watched her departure to the northern kingdoms that had learned her fairness, her impact lingered. England was no longer the uncertain power it had been when she first arrived. It had become a realm others sought to court, to trade with, and to emulate. This transformation, though gradual, had begun in the quiet wisdom of a woman who saw farther than most men of her age. Even as history moved on and her name slipped from popular memory, the shape of the kingdom bore her imprint. The navy that ruled the seas, the diplomacy that balanced power, the culture that valued thought and moderation, all were fruits of her vision. The historians who later chronicled England's rise often spoke of kings and conquerors, but in the margins of their writings, one can still find acknowledgement of the queen whose subtle guidance made such achievements possible. Her story became a testament to the idea that leadership could transcend the boundaries of birth and expectation. She had arrived as a foreigner and left as a founder of England's future strength. The geopolitical path she set in motion continued to unfold long after her time, carrying her quiet influence into every era that followed. What she built endured not because of force, but because it was grounded in balance and foresight. Her reign had not been about power seized, but about power understood. Through patience and wisdom, she had shown that a single marriage could indeed rewrite the fate of an empire, and that the legacy of one woman's mind could chart the course of a nation for centuries. The ripples of her life extended far beyond her time, guiding England steadily toward the greatness that would one day define it, all rooted in the enduring vision of the forgotten heiress who became the architect of its destiny. As the centuries unfolded, the memory of the queen who had once guided England through its most delicate transformations began to fade from the chronicles of power. Her influence had shaped the foundations upon which later generations built their triumphs, yet her name slowly slipped into the quiet margins of history. Her reign had not been marked by conquest, scandal, or the kind of spectacle that draws chroniclers to their pens. She had ruled through wisdom rather than force, through persuasion rather than decree, and in the records of her time, such virtues were often overlooked. The world tends to remember the roar of battle, not the calm that prevents it. Thus her silence, her most powerful instrument, became the very reason she was forgotten. The chroniclers who followed her era were mostly men of arms or clergy, drawn to tales of war and divine revelation. They wrote of victories and martyrdoms, of kings who commanded and generals who conquered. The queen's work, being subtle and humane, did not fit the language of legend. Her triumphs were measured not in enemies defeated, but in alliances forged, not in lands seized, but in lives spared. The peace she secured brought prosperity, but left few monuments. People remember fortresses, not treaties. They remember the sound of cannons, not the whisper of negotiation. Her greatest successes existed in the spaces between events, in the stability that made later glories possible. Over time, the narratives of England's greatness became dominated by the deeds of men. When later rulers extended the kingdom's reach, when explorers set sail under royal banners, when merchants founded empires of trade, their achievements were celebrated as the dawn of a new age. Few paused to consider that the very systems, alliances, and disciplines that made such feats possible had been established generations earlier by a queen whose intelligence had prepared the ground. She had redefined diplomacy, reorganized governance, and reshaped England's role among nations, yet history rewarded her modesty with obscurity. The fading of her story was not merely the result of neglect, but of the nature of her work itself. She built institutions that outlasted her and became so deeply embedded in English life that their origins were forgotten. Her influence became invisible precisely because it was complete. The fairness she brought to administration became the expected standard. The stability she created became the ordinary condition. Success, when it endures too long, often erases the memory of those who began it. Her lineage too contributed to the quieting of her name. Being of Portuguese birth, she never fully belonged to England in the eyes of its chroniclers. To them, she was always the foreign bride, never entirely of their soil. Her southern grace and reserved strength seemed too different from the English temperament to be celebrated as native virtues. When later historians recounted the line of queens, they tended to favor those whose stories echoed the familiar rhythms of national myth, the tragic, the defiant, or the grand. Her life, defined by reason and reconciliation, lacked the drama they sought. Even so, traces of her spirit remained scattered across the fabric of English governance and culture. Every generation that valued steady diplomacy over rash conflict, every monarch who ruled with patience rather than pride, every minister who placed negotiation above violence, owed something to her quiet precedent. She had shown that England's power need not rely on domination, but could arise from trust, partnership, and foresight. These lessons were absorbed so completely that they became instinctive. The later rise of England as a maritime and diplomatic power was not a spontaneous miracle. It was the flowering of seeds she had sown long before. Her naval reforms, modest in their beginnings, evolved into the framework that would one day carry English ships across the world. The emphasis she placed on discipline, innovation, and accountability in the fleet set a standard that endured through the ages. When later generations built mighty armadas that crossed oceans and established colonies, they did so on principles that traced back to her reforms. Her insistence that knowledge of the sea was as vital as the courage to face it inspired the first generations of English navigators who ventured beyond familiar waters. The spirit of exploration that later defined England's empire was, in essence, a continuation of her vision that mastery of the seas meant mastery of destiny. Her influence in diplomacy reached even further. The alliance she forged between England and Portugal became one of the most enduring in history. Through centuries of wars and upheavals, that bond remained intact, a testament to her foresight. Later kings and queens would draw upon this friendship in times of peril, finding in it the stability that only a relationship founded on respect could provide. Her model of alliance building, rooted in mutual benefit and cultural exchange rather than coercion, became a template for English diplomacy as it expanded across the continents. The treaties and marriages that shaped the political landscape of Europe in the following centuries bore the imprint of her methods, even if her name was absent from their preambles. The intellectual and moral legacy she left behind also continued to shape English thought. Her patronage of learning, her encouragement of scholars, and her belief in education as a foundation of governance nurtured a tradition that valued intellect as much as valor. In an age when women were often excluded from political influence, she had quietly proven that wisdom knew no gender. The memory of her court as a place of discourse and study lived on in the culture of English monarchy, influencing later queens who would also embrace the life of the mind. Though her name was rarely cited, her example stood as a silent prototype for the enlightened rulers who came after her. The fairness she demanded in governance and her compassion for the poor became part of the evolving conscience of English rule. Her policies of relief during times of famine and her reforms of land management created precedents that shaped how later monarchs viewed their duty to the people. Even centuries later, when reformers argued that rulers should serve justice rather than privilege, they were echoing her principles, though few realized it. Her belief that a kingdom's strength lay in the welfare of its subjects would resurface in moments of reform and renewal throughout English history. In the larger scheme of Europe's transformation, her life represented a bridge between medieval monarchy and the dawn of modern statecraft. She lived in an era when rule was still personal and divine, yet she introduced principles of governance that foreshadowed the administrative and diplomatic systems of later centuries. She turned the court from a stage of rivalry into a center of coordination, where policy was shaped by reason rather than whim. The subtle shift she initiated, from power expressed through domination to power maintained through order, became the foundation upon which modern monarchy rested. The reason her legacy faded was not that it lacked greatness, but that it lacked spectacle. History has always favored the visible over the profound. Those who win battles are remembered, while those who prevent them are forgotten. She had been the unseen architect of peace, and peace rarely writes itself into legend. Yet, when viewed through the lens of time, her impact appears not only monumental but revolutionary. She changed the way power functioned, altering its character from coercive to constructive. That transformation, quiet though it was, marked one of the most significant revolutions in England's long story. The centuries that followed carried forward her influence in ways that even she might not have foreseen. The measured diplomacy she established became the hallmark of English foreign policy, guiding the realm through alliances, rivalries, and empires. The emphasis she placed on maritime strength evolved into global dominance of the seas. The fairness she brought to governance became part of England's self-image as a just and stable power. Each of these developments, though attributed to later rulers, drew upon the foundation she had built. She was the architect whose name was hidden behind the walls she had designed. Her story's obscurity also reflects the broader tendency of history to overlook women whose power was exercised through intellect rather than force. The chroniclers of her time lacked the language to describe such influence. They understood queens who inspired passion or caused scandal, but not one who transformed a nation through reason. The silence surrounding her name reveals as much about the recorders of history as it does about her life. For them, power had to be loud to be real. For her, its strength lay in being quiet enough to endure. In later centuries, when England's empire reached its height, few connected that vast network of trade and diplomacy back to the woman who had first understood the world as a web of relationships rather than rivalries. Yet her vision anticipated it. She saw that influence could travel farther than armies, that trust could achieve what treaties could not, and that a kingdom built upon fairness would command loyalty even beyond its borders. The expansion that later defined England's global identity carried within it echoes of her earliest strategies, a belief in preparation, discipline, and balance. Even the evolution of English constitutional thought bore traces of her legacy. The idea that a ruler should listen, deliberate, and act in the interest of the people rather than personal ambition was embedded in her governance. Later parliaments, councils, and courts of justice developed along those same principles. Though the forms changed in centuries past, the spirit of her leadership endured, the conviction that authority, to be legitimate, must serve rather than command. As history turned its gaze to the great events that followed, the age of exploration, the reformation of faith, the wars of succession, her name remained in the shadows. Yet beneath each new triumph lay the structure she had built. The steady monarchy that weathered upheaval, the disciplined fleet that carried England's flag across oceans, the diplomatic corps that negotiated alliances across continents. All were descendants of her work. She was the invisible cornerstone upon which an empire would rise. If her story was overlooked, it was perhaps because she herself would have wanted it so. She had lived her life not for recognition, but for results. Her satisfaction had come from seeing peace maintained, prosperity spread, and justice done. To her, glory was fleeting, but but the quiet progress of a well-governed realm was eternal. She believed that rulers were not remembered for their words, but for the harmony they left behind. In that measure, her success was complete. Yet time, though slow, has a way of restoring what it once obscured. Modern scholars who have revisited the chronicles of her era find in them the unmistakable outline of a mind that shaped events more deeply than any general or minister. Her correspondence, her reforms, her recorded conversations, all reveal a strategist of rare clarity and compassion. They show a woman who understood the world in layers, political, economic, and human. They reveal not just a queen but a philosopher of power, one who believed that greatness lay not in dominion but in dignity. Her life also serves as a reminder that the course of history is not only written by those who stand at the front of armies or on the steps of thrones. It is also shaped by those who sit in silence, thinking, listening, and guiding with patience. Her revolution was unsung because it was inward. It changed not the boundaries of nations, but the nature of rule itself. By teaching a kingdom how to govern wisely, she laid the groundwork for an empire that would endure beyond her wildest imagining. In the centuries that followed, as England rose to global prominence, the echoes of her vision resounded in every negotiation, every voyage, and every law. The rational diplomacy she practiced became the model for modern statecraft. The emphasis she placed on education and merit inspired later reforms that expanded knowledge beyond the court. Even the moral restraint she embodied, the belief that power must be tempered by conscience, remained a guiding ideal in England's political tradition. Her legacy, though largely unacknowledged, can be traced through the rhythm of English progress. From the steady governance of the Tudor courts to the calculated diplomacy of later monarchs, from the disciplined fleets that explored the world to the councils that governed distant colonies, her influence can be felt like the pulse beneath the surface. Each achievement of England's later might was built upon the invisible order she had crafted. She had transformed her adopted land from a realm of rivalry into one of purpose, from a kingdom reacting to events into a nation shaping them. And yet, history rarely rewards those who build foundations. It celebrates the towers that rise above them. But a foundation endures. Long after the banners fade and the names of conquerors blur, her work remains, quietly supporting everything that followed. To recognize her today is not to rewrite history, but to finally read it fully. To see that behind every enduring power stands someone who understood how to make strength sustainable. Her story, once forgotten, now emerges as a testament to the unseen forces that truly shaped the world. She was the embodiment of wisdom in an age that prized might, the patient architect of a peace that became prosperity, the bridge between nations and eras. Her revolution did not break empires, it built one. It did not shout, it whispered. But its echoes have lasted longer than any battle cry. In her life, one can see the truth that power guided by understanding outlives the power that conquers by force. Her legacy is the quiet revolution of reason, the transformation of a kingdom into a nation of endurance, of a queen into a symbol of timeless influence. Though history may have passed her by in its haste to record the louder deeds of others, her impact remains woven into every chapter that followed. She was, and remains, the unacknowledged founder of England's strength, the forgotten architect of its empire, the unseen force behind its centuries of stability. Her life proved that greatness need not demand attention to be real. It is enough that it lasts. And her legacy, though unsung, endures still, alive in the peace she built, the justice she inspired, and the nation she quietly taught to lead the world.